A drone captures an abandoned tent after 16 years. What was inside solves the mystery. The hum was the first thing. A low, persistent drone, like a mechanical insect searching for a place to die. For 16 years, the Cascade Mountains had kept their silence, swallowing secrets whole and digesting them in the dark, damp earth. But the drone, DJI Mavic 3, with a Hasselblad eye, cared nothing for secrets. It saw only pixels, topography, and the stark, pale anomaly against the deep green canvas of the alpine forest. Leo gripped the controller, his knuckles white. The screen glowed in the dim light of his Seattle apartment, the city's drizzle streaking the windowpane behind him. He was a hobbyist, a weekend cartographer of the forgotten. He flew his drone over ghost towns, abandoned mines, and the husks of forgotten homesteads. Today, he'd chosen a remote section of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, a place whispered about in online forums, a place where the trees grew too close and the trails vanished into thin air, a place where, in the summer of 2008, the Miller family had evaporated. The anomaly was a tent, a faded Kelty six-person dome, its once vibrant blue bleached to the color of a cataractous eye. It was snagged in the claw-like branches of a fallen Douglas fir, impossibly high on a ridge that no sane hiker would attempt. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite. This was a tomb. He nudged the joystick, the drone descending with a soft whir. The camera zoomed, its lens slicing through the misty air. The tent's rainfly was shredded, hanging in tattered ribbons that swayed in the breeze, like prayer flags for the dead. One of the poles had snapped, piercing the nylon skin, a skeletal finger pointing towards the indifferent sky. But the zipper was still closed. A tremor went through Leo's hands. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a rescuer. He was a 34-year-old software engineer with a mortgage and a failed marriage. A man who sought solace in the quiet hum of propellers and the God's eye view of the world. But he knew what this was. Everyone in Washington knew the story of the Millers. David, the father, a smiling, affable dentist. His wife, Sarah, a vibrant kindergarten teacher. Their two children, 8-year-old Chloe, with her gap-toothed grin, and 6-year-old Finn, a shy boy who was never seen without his favorite stuffed bear. They had driven up to the mountains for a weekend camping trip and had never come back. The search had been biblical. Helicopters, search dogs, hundreds of volunteers combing the wilderness for weeks that bled into months. They found their car. At a trailhead, locked and undisturbed, they found a single, child-sized hiking boot, waterlogged in a creek bed miles away. And then, nothing. The forest had simply taken them. The case went cold, hardening into a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children about straying from the path. Now Leo's drone was hovering before the sealed door of their final resting place. His breath hitched. He had to see inside. It was a violation, a desecration, but the not knowing was a physical weight, a pressure building behind his eyes. He edged the drone closer, the propellers kicking up a small flurry of pine needles. The goal was to get the camera to see through a tear in the fabric, a rip near the base of the tent. He maneuvered the drone with a surgeon's precision. The lens pressed against the frayed nylon. The view shifted, plunging into the gloomy interior. For a moment, there was only darkness. Then, the camera's sensor adjusted, and the scene resolved itself with horrifying clarity. It wasn't a scene of struggle, it was a scene of perfect, unnatural stillness. A tableau of domesticity frozen in time. 4 sleeping bags, arranged in a neat row. 2 adult-sized, 2 child-sized. They were zipped up tight, as if their occupants were merely sleeping, waiting for the morning sun. But the lumps within were too small, too settled. The air, even viewed through a screen, seemed thick with the dust of 16 years. A sacred, suffocating silence. Leo's stomach churned. He could make out shapes. In the smallest bag, the one that must have been Finn's, a familiar form was clutched within the decayed fabric, the unmistakable silhouette of a teddy bear. The sight was a punch to the gut, a visceral connection to the ghost of a little boy who had died clinging to his only comfort. Then he saw the camera. It was an old Sony Handycam, circa 2008, resting on a small collapsible camping table in the center of the tent. It was positioned carefully, its lens pointing directly at the row of sleeping bags. A silent sentinel that had stood guard over the dead for more than a decade and a half. A cold dread, sharp and electric, snaked up Leo's spine. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a family that had succumbed to exposure or a sudden storm. This was staged. This was a performance, and it had been recorded. His mind raced. The memory card. Was it possible? After all this time, could it still hold its data? Lithium-ion batteries would be long dead, but the flash memory could be resilient. He had to get the footage. He couldn't call the police, not yet. They would cordon off the area, treat him like a suspect, confiscate his drone. The story would be filtered through press releases and sterile official statements. The raw, unvarnished truth was sitting on that table. And Leo felt an obsessive, almost fanatical need to be the one to uncover it. This was his discovery. His responsibility. The decision was insane, and he knew it. He was a civilian. The ridge was treacherous. But the image of that Handycam, its dark lens like a single, unblinking eye, had imprinted itself on his soul. The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and fear. He bought climbing gear he barely knew how to use. He led to his boss, calling in sick with a fabricated case of food poisoning. He drove his Subaru into the mountains. The drone and its controller on the passenger seat like a holy relic. The hike was brutal. The trail the Millers had used was long gone, reclaimed by the relentless growth of the forest. Leo had to bushwhack. Using his drone's GPS data to guide him, thorns tore at his clothes and skin. The air grew thin and cold. Twice, he nearly turned back, his lungs burning, his courage failing. But the image of the 4 sleeping bags propelled him forward. He owed it to them. To Chloe and Finn. When he finally saw it, nestled high in the splintered embrace of the fallen fir, the tent looked even more forlorn than it had on his screen. A tattered flag of surrender. The final ascent was a terrifying scramble up the rock face and along the trunk of the dead tree. The wood was slick with moss and decay. His fingers, numb with cold, scrabbled for purchase. He could feel the abyss below him, a hungry, waiting void. He reached the tent, his body screaming in protest. He clung to a branch, his cheek pressed against the rough bark, panting. The air smelled of damp earth, of decay, of time itself. With a trembling hand, he reached for the zipper. It was stiff, corroded, but it gave way with a gritty shriek. The sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. The smell hit him first. Not the overpowering stench of decomposition he had dreaded, that had long since been scoured away by the seasons, but a dry, dusty odor. The smell of old paper, of dried flowers, of memories turned to dust. He pulled the flap open and crawled inside. The scene was exactly as he had witnessed it through the drone's eye. The 4 sleeping bags, the small table, the camera. It was a shrine, a perfectly preserved moment of utter despair. He moved carefully, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He reached for the Handycam, his fingers brushing against the cold plastic. He fumbled with the side latch, his hands shaking so violently he could barely control them. The memory card slot popped open. It was there. A 1 GB Sony memory stick duo. A tiny sliver of plastic that held the key to a mystery. He pocketed the card and backed out of the tent, zipping it closed again, as if to tuck the dead back in. The climb down was even more treacherous. His mind consumed by what he now possessed. Back in his car, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a deep, bone-rattling chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He didn't have a device that could read the old memory stick. He drove back to Seattle in a daze, the city lights feeling alien and intrusive after the solemn darkness of the forest. He found a 24-hour electronics store, his face pale and haggard under the fluorescent lights as he bought a universal memory card reader. In his apartment, with the door locked and the blinds drawn, he plugged the reader into his laptop. He inserted the memory stick, His computer chimed, recognizing the new device. A folder appeared on his screen. DCIM. Inside it, a single video file, MAGB, 001, AVI. His hand hovered over the trackpad. A profound sense of trespass washing over him. This was not his story. This was a family's final, private moments. But he had come this far, he had to know. He double-clicked, the video player opened. The screen was black for a second, and then an image flickered to life. The quality was grainy, the lighting poor, illuminated only by a single camping lantern hanging from the tent's ceiling. The audio crackled with static. A man's face filled the frame. It was David Miller. But this was not the smiling dentist. From the missing person posters, this was a man hollowed out by something far worse than fear. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring into the lens as if it were the face of God himself. His skin was pale, his cheeks gaunt. He was speaking. His voice was a raw, broken whisper, a sound scraped from the very bottom of his soul. "My name is David Miller," he began, his gaze unwavering. "If you are watching this, it means we are gone. It means he won. I want you to know. I want everyone to know what he did to us. What he made me do." He paused, swallowing hard. A tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. Her name was Sarah. My Sarah and Chloe. And my boy, my Finn. He choked on the names, his composure shattering for a moment. He squeezed his eyes shut, his face contorting in a mask of pure agony. "We didn't get lost," he whispered, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a venomous hatred. "We were driven here, hunted. He told me this was the only way. The only way to save them from what came next." Leo leaned closer to the screen, his blood turning to ice. Who was he? David's eyes snapped open again, burning with a feverish intensity. "He's a pillar of this community. A man everyone trusts, a man I trusted. My mentor, my friend." He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He owns a cabin, not 5 miles from here. He told me it was his sanctuary, his private retreat." David's gaze shifted, looking past the camera, as if seeing something in the dark corners of the tent. "He said the debt was due, a pound of flesh. That's what he called it. He said, my success, my practice, my family. It was all built on a foundation he'd laid, and it was time to pay him back. He didn't want money." A new wave of tears streamed down David's face. He wasn't just sad, he was terrified. A primal animal terror that seemed to radiate from the screen. "He gave me a choice," David rasped, his voice cracking. "A choice no man should ever have to make. He brought the supplies, the sleeping bags, the medicine. He said it would be peaceful, a quiet sleep. He said it was this, or he would take them himself, and he would make it hurt." He described what he would do to Sarah, to my Chloe. Leo felt a surge of nausea. The medicine, the sleeping bags. This wasn't a suicide. This was a forced execution. A family erased by an invisible hand. "His name," David said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, as if the man himself might hear. "His name is Judge Alistair Finch." The name hit Leo like a physical blow. Judge Alistair Finch, the revered silver-haired patriarch of the King County Superior Court. A man lauded for his charity work, his unwavering moral compass, his decades of public service. He was a local icon, a living landmark. It was impossible. It was insane. On the screen, David Miller began to weep uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking. The camera's view tilted downwards, and for the first time, Leo saw the rest of the scene. Sarah was already in her sleeping bag, her face serene, almost beatific. She looked like she was asleep. Beside her, 2 small, still forms, Chloe and Finn, tucked in for their final night. David's hand came into frame. He was holding a small, clear vial and a syringe. "He's watching," David whispered, his eyes darting towards the tent flap. "I know he is. He said he'd be out there. To make sure I did it right. To make sure I was a good father." The final words were a scream of silent, unending agony. David raised the vial, his hand shaking violently. He looked into the camera. One last time, his eyes pleading, begging for a forgiveness that would never come. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "Sarah, Chloe Finn, I'm so sorry." He turned the camera away, pointing it back towards the row of sleeping bags, documenting the silent, horrific scene. The view remained fixed. The only sound was David's ragged breathing, then a soft final sigh. The lantern flickered. The screen went black dot. Leo recoiled from his laptop, shoving his chair back so hard it slammed into the wall. He scrambled to his feet, pacing his small apartment like a caged animal. His heart was a jackhammer. Judge Alistair Finch, a man he'd seen on the news a dozen times, handing down sentences, speaking at charity galas, the very picture of justice and integrity. The video wasn't just a confession, it was an accusation, a ghost's testimony, and Leo was the only one who had seen it. He looked at the memory card, a tiny, innocuous piece of plastic that now felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He was holding a story that could shatter a city, destroy a powerful man, and exhume a truth that had been buried for 16 years. The weight of it was crushing. What was he supposed to do? Go to the police? Who would believe him? An anonymous tech worker with a drone and a stolen memory card against the titan of the legal system. Finch would crush him. He would bury the evidence, discredit Leo, and walk away clean. The hum of his refrigerator filled the silence, a low, mocking drone. He felt a sudden, chilling certainty. David's last words echoed in his mind. "He's watching. I know he is." What if, somehow, Finch knew the tent had been found? What if he was already moving, preparing to silence the only person who held the truth? Leo's apartment, once his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a glass cage. He walked to the window and peered through the blinds at the rain-slicked street below. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every passing car seemed to slow, its occupants watching his window. The paranoia was immediate, suffocating. He was no longer just a hobbyist. He was a witness, and in a story like this, the witness was always the next target. The hum of the drone had led him to a tomb, and now, he realized with a terrifying clarity, it may have just sealed his own. The journey into the past began not with the judge, but with the ghost of the man he had destroyed. To understand the monster, Leo first had to understand the victim. He needed to know David Miller, not as the weeping, broken man in the video, but as the person he was before Alistair Finch bled the life from him. He started with old newspapers, archived online. David Miller, DDS. He'd opened his first dental practice in Bellevue in 2002. Photos showed a handsome man with an easy, confident smile, his arm wrapped around his wife, Sarah. The articles were glowing. Dr. Miller was praised for his gentle touch, his state-of-the-art clinic, and his community outreach, offering free dental care to low-income families once a month. He found Sarah's school website, preserved in a digital archive. Her kindergarten teacher profile was filled with warmth. Her favorite children's book was Where the Wild Things Are. Her teaching philosophy was to find the magic in every day. A photo showed her sitting on a colorful rug, surrounded by a sea of beaming 5-year-olds, her own smile the brightest of all. They were the perfect couple, the perfect family. The American dream, polished to a high shine. But the polish was a veneer. Digging deeper, Leo found the cracks. He searched property records, financial statements, anything he could access through public databases and a few legally grey online services. The state-of-the-art clinic had been expensive. Terribly expensive. David had taken out a series of higher-risk loans in the early 2000s, leveraging everything he had. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. The ground had crumbled beneath everyone's feet, and David Miller, over-leveraged and exposed, had been caught in the earthquake. Leo found forum posts from a local dental community website, dated from late 2007 to mid-2008. The tone shifted from optimistic to strained, then to desperate. David wrote about dwindling patient numbers, the soaring cost of supplies, the predatory interest rates on his loans. He was drowning. This was the vulnerability. This was the opening Finch had needed, and then he found the first connection. A Brief mention in a 2006 Society column in the Seattle Times. A photo from a fundraiser for the King County Children's Alliance. A beaming David and Sarah Miller stood next to a regal, smiling Judge Alistair Finch. The caption read, "Dr. David Miller and his wife Sarah. Protégés of the evening's host, Judge Alistair Finch." Protégés, the word was a serpent. Finch hadn't just been a friend, he had been a patron. He had taken the ambitious young dentist under his wing. He had likely been the source of the private off-the-books loans that had both saved and damned David Miller. He had built the foundation, just as David had said in the video. And he had come to collect. Now, it was time to look at the monster. Himself, Judge Alistair Finch was not a man. He was an institution. Born into old Seattle money, his family's name was carved onto university buildings and hospital wings. He had attended Yale Law, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and had been appointed to the bench at an uncommonly young age. His career was flawless, a monument to civic duty and judicial wisdom. He was famously tough on crime, his sentences often making headlines for their severity. He spoke of morality, of a clear and unshakable line between right and wrong. But, as Leo scraped away the public relations lacquer, a different portrait emerged. He found whispers of a darker side in sealed court documents he paid a hacker on the dark web to unseal. Finch had a reputation among defense attorneys as a tyrant in the courtroom, a man who enjoyed the fear he inspired. There were allegations of judicial misconduct, all quietly dismissed. Rumors of a volatile temper, of a cruel streak hidden behind his grandfatherly facade. He had a wife, Eleanor, who was as quiet and translucent as he was forceful and opaque. She rarely appeared in public, and when she did, she looked like a hostage. Her smile, a brittle, painted-on thing. They had one child, a son named Julian, who had died of a drug overdose 20 years ago. The tragedy was a core part of Finch's public narrative, the source of his crusade against the moral decay of society. But Leo found an old police report, heavily redacted. Julian hadn't just overdosed, he'd done so in a squalid motel room. And the report noted signs of a struggle and an unidentified older male, who had fled the scene just before the police arrived. The case was never solved. The loose ends were tucked away, buried by the weight of Finch's influence. Finch's power wasn't just in his gavel. It was in the web of favors and obligations he had spun over decades. He sat on the boards of banks, charities, and corporations. He had placed his former clerks in positions of power throughout the city's legal and political infrastructure. To challenge Alistair Finch was to challenge the entire system. He was a king in his own kingdom. The most disturbing discovery came from a deep dive into land ownership records near the Cascade foothills. In 1999, Finch had purchased a large, isolated parcel of land, the very land he'd mentioned to David. He built a cabin there, his sanctuary. But it wasn't registered under his name. It was owned by a shell corporation, a labyrinth of legal entities that eventually traced back to a law firm in the Cayman Islands. He had created a place where he could be invisible, a place with no neighbors, no prying eyes, a place where a man could hunt another man and nobody would ever know. The picture was coalescing into something monstrous. Finch, the grieving father, had twisted his own tragedy into a weapon. He didn't just punish criminals. He seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from orchestrating the downfall of those he deemed morally weak. He had seen David Miller's financial desperation not with pity, but with an artist's eye for a perfect canvas. He had loaned him the money, let him build his dream, let him taste happiness with his beautiful wife and children. He had given him everything, just so he could have the pleasure of taking it all away. It was a game, a sick, elaborate, sadistic game played by a man who had absolute power. But there was a missing piece. A witness. A story this dark required someone who had seen it, someone who had lived in its shadow. Who else knew? Who else was complicit in their silence? The answer, Leo suspected, was not in a public record. It was in a person. And the only other person in Finch's orbit who seemed as broken as David Miller was his wife, Eleanor. Finding her was not easy. She no longer lived with the judge in their palatial home in Laurelhurst. Public records showed she had moved out 3 years ago, citing irreconcilable differences in a quiet, no-fault divorce that was settled out of court with an ironclad NDA. She now lived in a modest condo on Bainbridge Island, a ferry ride away from the city and a world away from the life she had once known. She had taken back her maiden name, Eleanor Vance. She was trying to disappear. Leo knew he couldn't just approach her. He couldn't knock on her door with a wild story about a 16-year-old video. She would call the police, or worse, she would call her ex-husband. He needed leverage. He needed to understand her. He spent a week observing. He took the ferry to the island, rented a car, and parked down the street from her condo complex. He watched her through a telephoto lens, feeling like a predator, but driven by a desperate need for the truth. Eleanor was a ghost, a tall, achingly thin woman with silver hair and the haunted, vacant eyes of a long-term trauma survivor. She moved with a slow, deliberate fragility, as if a sudden gust of wind might shatter her. She had a routine. In the morning, she would walk a small, scruffy terrier along the waterfront. She never smiled, never made eye contact with other dog walkers. In the afternoon, she would tend to a small garden on her balcony, her movements precise and mechanical. She had no visitors. No friends seemed to call. She was utterly, profoundly alone. She was a woman living in a self-imposed prison. One afternoon, he saw her at a small cafe near the ferry terminal. She was sitting alone, staring into a cup of tea, her hands wrapped around it as if for warmth. He saw his chance. It was reckless, but he had to take it. He walked in, his heart pounding. He sat at a table near hers, pretending to read a newspaper. He waited for a moment when she looked up, her gaze drifting aimlessly around the room. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He gave a small, hesitant smile. She looked away instantly, her body tensing, pulling into itself as if bracing for a blow. He had frightened her. Of course he had. To this woman, a strange man's attention was not a kindness. It was a threat. He knew he needed a different approach. He needed to show her he wasn't a threat, but an ally. He needed to speak her language, the language of secrets and pain. He went back to his car and, on a piece of notepaper, wrote 7 words. I know what happened to the Millers. He returned to the cafe. She was still there, a statue of sorrow. He walked past her table, and as he did, he let the folded note slip from his hand, letting it fall to the floor near her feet. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He walked out of the cafe and back to his car, his entire body trembling. He watched through his lens. He saw her notice the paper on the floor. She stared at it for a long time. Then, with a furtive, bird-like movement, she bent down and picked it up. She unfolded it beneath the table. Out of sight, Leo held his breath. He saw her shoulders stiffen. Her head snapped up, her eyes frantically scanning the cafe, then the street outside. Her face, which had been a mask of numb resignation, was now alive with pure, unadulterated terror. She crumpled the note, threw some cash on the table, and fled, practically running back to the safety of her condo. He had his witness, and he had just terrified her into silence. But the silence was a confirmation. Her fear was the evidence. Eleanor Vance knew everything. She had been living with the rot for years, the secret a cancer eating her from the inside out. David's ghost wasn't the only one crying out for justice. So was the judge's wife. She had been the hidden witness all along. Trapped in a gilded cage with the monster himself, forced to watch his cruel games, her silence the price of her own survival. And Leo had just thrown a rock through the window of her prison. The question was, would she crawl through the broken glass, or would she retreat deeper into the darkness? The terror he had ignited in Eleanor Vance was a fire that could either illuminate the path or burn everything to the ground. For 3 days, there was nothing. A profound, terrifying silence. Eleanor didn't leave her condo. The blinds remained drawn. Leo stayed on the island, sleeping in his car, fueled by stale coffee and the gnawing fear that he had pushed too hard. That he had driven the only other person who knew the truth into a hole so deep she'd never climb out. He imagined Alistair Finch getting a panicked call, his powerful machinery of suppression kicking into gear. Leo started checking his rearview mirror constantly, convinced a black sedan was tailing him. Every unknown number on his phone sent a jolt of panic through him. On the fourth night, his phone buzzed, an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. His hand shook as he swiped to accept the call. "Is this you?" The voice was a dry whisper, thin and brittle like old parchment. "It was Eleanor." "Yes," Leo said, his own voice hoarse. "Meet me. The old lighthouse at the south end of the island. 1 hour. Come alone." The line went dead. The lighthouse was a skeletal ruin, a relic from another century standing on a windswept point. The wind howled, whipping the sea into a frenzy. It was the perfect place for a clandestine meeting or an execution. Leo arrived early, his headlights cutting through the driving rain. He saw her car, a modest Prius. Already parked near the crumbling foundation, she was standing at the base of the tower, a lone, frail silhouette against the raging storm. The wind tore at her coat, whipping her silver hair across her face. She looked like a figure from a Gothic novel, a woman perpetually haunted. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, as he approached, her voice barely audible over the gale. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark in the gloom. "You don't know what he is, you can't comprehend it." "I saw the video, Eleanor," Leo said softly. "I saw what David Miller said. I saw what he did." A shudder racked her body. It wasn't a denial. It was a confirmation, a physical release of a burden she had carried for 16 years. "David," she whispered, the name a prayer and a curse. "He was a good man, a weak man, but a good one. Alistair. Alistair likes to find the cracks in people. He sees goodness as a flaw to be exploited, a toy to be broken." She turned to face him, the rain plastering her hair to her cheeks. "You think this was about money? A debt? That was just the excuse. This was about sport." Alistair was bored. His usual games-ruining careers, blackmailing politicians, it wasn't enough anymore. He needed something more visceral. The story she told was more depraved than Leo could have imagined. Finch hadn't just coerced David. He had systematically dismantled him, piece by piece, over the course of a year. It was a campaign of psychological torture. He would summon David to the cabin, his sanctuary, for meetings. At first, he was the concerned mentor, offering advice. Then, the tone shifted. He started making subtle threats. He'd mention Sarah's beauty, Chloe's innocence, Finn's fragility. He would talk about the darkness in the world, the predators that lurked just beyond the firelight, all while staring directly into David's soul. He was planting a seed of terror. "He made David watch things," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. She wouldn't elaborate, but Leo's mind filled in the horrific blanks. Finch was conditioning him, breaking down his moral defenses, showing him the kind of cruelty he was capable of, to prove his threats were real. "The weekend of the camping trip, that was Alistair's idea," she continued. "He called it the final lesson. He presented it as a mercy. He convinced David that the authorities were closing in, that his financial ruin was imminent, and that the state would take his children. He painted a picture of a life of shame and poverty, of Chloe and Finn being lost to the foster system, abused and forgotten. He told David that a quiet death in the mountains was the only honorable way out. A final act of paternal love. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a sick, twisted logic that could only take root in a mind already ravaged by fear and despair. "And the camera?" Leo prompted gently. "That was the masterstroke," Eleanor said with a bitter, hollow laugh. "The performance, Alistair wanted a record. He wanted to be able to watch it, to relive it. He told David the video would be his legacy, a testament to his sacrifice. But it was for him. It was his trophy." She described the night of the disappearances. Alistair had come home late, his eyes alight with a feverish, triumphant glow Leo had seen only in predators. He was electric with a dark energy. He didn't say a word about what he had done, but Eleanor knew. She could feel it, a cold radiation of death coming off him. She had lived with him for 30 years. She knew the topography of his evil. The night I confronted him, she said. I told him I knew he'd done something terrible. He didn't deny it, he just smiled. That was the worst part. The smile. He walked over to his study, unlocked the safe, and took out a small black Sony camera. He told me he had something to show me. He called it a work of art. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, the memory of fresh torment. He made me watch it, Leo. He sat me down in a chair and played David's confession on the television. He stood behind me, his hands on my shoulders, and he made me watch that poor man fall apart. He made me watch him prepare the syringes. When it was over, he leaned down and whispered in my ear, "Now you are a part of it. Now, you are my witness." He trapped me. My silence wasn't just about fear for myself, it was about complicity. He had made me an accessory to his masterpiece. The cruelty was breathtaking. He hadn't just killed a family, he had murdered his wife's soul, chaining her to his crime forever. The NDA from their divorce wasn't just about money. It was about ensuring she never spoke. For years, I've been living in hell, she said, her voice breaking. Every time I saw his face on the news, lauded as a paragon of virtue, I would feel the scream building in my throat. He destroyed them, and he destroyed me. And he has never paid a price. The wind howled, and a wave crashed against the rocks below, the spray misting over them. The injustice of it was a physical thing, a suffocating weight. Finch was more than a murderer. He was a god in his own sick universe. And his wife and the Millers were just his playthings. He still has the camera, Eleanor whispered, a new urgency in her voice. He would never destroy his trophy. He keeps it in the safe in his study. He probably still watches it. On special occasions, a plan began to form in Leo's mind, audacious and incredibly dangerous. The video on the memory card was powerful, but it was just a copy. David's word against a judge. Finch's lawyers would tear it apart, claim it was coerced, faked. But the original camera, in the judge's possession, that was the smoking gun. That was possession. That was the nail for his coffin. "We have to get it," Leo said, the words tasting like madness on his tongue. "Eleanor, we have to get that camera." She looked at him, her eyes widening in horror. "You're insane. That house is a fortress. He has security alarms. He would kill you. He would kill us both. He's already killing you," Leo countered, his voice firm. "Slowly, every day. You said it yourself. This is the only way. For you, for them." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, beneath the layers of fear. A spark of defiance that had been buried for 16 years. The terror he had ignited in her was finally turning to rage. "His charity holds an annual gala," she said, thinking aloud, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The Justice Ball. It's next week. It's the one night of the year he is guaranteed to be out of the house for at least 5 hours. He's the guest of honor. He'd never miss it." She looked at Leo, a silent, terrifying question passing. Between them, could they do it? Could they walk into the lion's den and steal the proof of his sins? "The security system," she said, her mind working, piecing together the details of the prison she had once called home. "He trusts me. He was so confident in his power over me, he never changed the master codes after I left. I still know them." The confession hung in the air between them, a stunning, unbelievable gift. The hidden witness was no longer just a source. She was a key. "His study is on the 2nd floor, she continued, the words coming faster now, a torrent of pent-up knowledge. "The safe is behind a false bookshelf. It's a Kaba Mars X10. Military grade. Even if we get in the house, we'll never get into that safe." Leo's heart sank. It was a dead end. But, Eleanor added, a cunning light in her eyes he had never seen before, "Alistair is a man of routine, of arrogance. He believes no one would ever dare to cross him. He keeps the combination written down." Where Leo breathed. Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest, most bitter of smiles. In the one place he believes is truly sacred. The one place he thinks no one would ever defile. She paused, letting the weight of the revelation settle. It's taped to the back of a framed photograph on his desk. A photograph of his son Julian. The sheer, sickening irony of it was a gut punch. The man who had orchestrated the death of another man's children kept the key to his own damnation hidden behind the image of his own lost son. The plot twist wasn't just a clue, it was a piece of poetic justice, a sign from the ghosts of the past. The stage was set. The conflict had escalated from a search for truth to a high-stakes heist, a direct assault on the monster in his lair. The full, sprawling conspiracy was now clear. A powerful judge, a psychologically broken victim, a tortured witness, and a crime so perfect it was considered a work of art by its creator. The tension was no longer just a quiet paranoia. It was a live wire, humming with the promise of either spectacular justice or total annihilation. The fate of the truth, and their lives, now rested on a single night, a single code, and the audacity to steal a memory from a king. The night of the Justice Ball was unnervingly beautiful. A fat, luminous moon hung over Seattle, silvering the waters of Lake Washington. From his vantage point, in a rented van parked a block away, Leo watched the parade of the city's elite arrive at the waterfront convention center. Tuxedos, glittering gowns, the flash of cameras. And in the center of it all, Judge Alistair Finch, stepping out of a black town car. A benevolent king accepting the adulation of his court. He smiled, waved, the very picture of civic grace. Leo felt a surge of bile in his throat. In the passenger seat, Eleanor Vance was a statue carved from ice. She was dressed in simple, dark clothes, her face pale, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were bone white. She hadn't spoken a word for the last hour. She just watched the man who had stolen her life, her breath fogging the windowpane. "He's inside," Leo said softly, as Finch disappeared through the glass doors. "It's time." Eleanor didn't respond. She just gave a single, sharp nod. The spark of defiance he'd seen at the lighthouse had been forged into a diamond-hard resolve. This was her moment of reclamation. The drive to Laurelhurst was silent and tense. The judge's mansion was a stone fortress, set back from the road behind a high rottion fence. It was dark, imposing, every window a vacant eye. It looked exactly like the lair of a monster. "Pull into the service entrance around the back," Eleanor instructed, her voice a low, steady whisper. "There's less light there." Leo did as he was told, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was insane. He was a software engineer, about to commit breaking and entering on the home of one of the most powerful men in the state. They slipped out of the van and crept through the manicured gardens. The scent of roses and damp earth thick in the air. They reached a small side door. Eleanor pulled a key from her pocket. "He never changed the locks, either," she murmured, a statement of her ex-husband's profound arrogance. "He never believed I would have the courage to come back." The key turned. The lock clicked. The sound was deafening in the silence. They stepped inside, into the kitchen. It was sterile, gleaming, a museum of a life, not a home. The air was cold and still. Eleanor moved with a ghostly familiarity, her feet silent on the polished marble floors. She led him through the cavernous, silent house, past grand rooms filled with antique furniture and priceless art. All of it feeling like plunder from a long and successful war. They reached the grand staircase. "The alarm panel is at the top," Eleanor whispered, her breath clouding in the cold air. "I have to be fast." She moved up the stairs with a speed that belied her frail appearance. Leo followed, his senses on high alert, every creak of a floorboard sounding like a gunshot. Eleanor reached the panel, her fingers hovering over the keypad for a moment. She took a deep breath, and then, with swift certain movements, she punched in the code. A small green light blinked on. The system was disarmed. A wave of relief, so intense it almost made Leo dizzy, washed over him. They were in. The study was at the end of the hall. The door was thick, heavy oak. Eleanor pushed it open, and they stepped into the heart of the beast's den. The room smelled of old leather, whiskey, and something else. Something cloying and unpleasant. The smell of self-satisfaction. The walls were lined with books, not the well-worn paperbacks of a reader, but the pristine leather-bound sets of a collector. It was a room designed to impress, to intimidate, and on the far wall, behind the massive mahogany desk, was the false bookshelf. The photo, Leo whispered. Eleanor moved towards the desk, her steps faltering for the first time. On the corner of the desk sat a single, ornate silver frame. The smiling face of a young man with his father's eyes looked out at them. Julian. Eleanor reached for it, her hand trembling. She turned it over. Taped to the velvet backing was a small yellowed piece of paper. On it, in the judge's precise, elegant script, was a sequence of numbers. She read them aloud, her voice cracking with the terrible irony of it all. His birthday, Julian's birthday, August 14th, 84. Leo felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Finch's cruelty knew no bounds. He had turned the memory of his own son into a key for a safe that held the evidence of how he'd destroyed another man's sons. Now for the safe. Eleanor ran her hands along the edge of the bookshelf. Her fingers found a small, almost invisible indentation. She pressed it with a soft hydraulic hiss. A section of the bookshelf swung inwards, revealing a heavy grey steel door. The Kaba, Maz X10. A single digital keypad glowed in the center. Leo held his breath as Eleanor carefully entered Julian's birthday. The lock beeped, a series of electronic clicks echoed in the silent room, and then a heavy thud as the bolts retracted. She pulled the heavy door open. The inside of the safe was not filled with cash or jewels. It was an archive of secrets. There were folders containing what looked like blackmail material on a dozen different prominent figures. There were deeds, offshore account statements, a web of corruption that went far deeper than Leo could have ever imagined. And on the top shelf, sitting alone like a crown jewel, was the black Sony HANDY-CAM. Eleanor reached in and took it. She held it in her hands as if it were a venomous snake. For a moment, she just stared at it, her face a mask of grief and fury. This small plastic object was the repository of 16 years of her pain. Suddenly, a sound from downstairs, a chime. The sound of the front door opening. They both froze, their blood turning to ice. A voice called out. "Alistair, are you here? I saw the lights." Leo's mind went blank with panic. Someone was in the house. They were trapped. Eleanor's reaction was instantaneous. Her fear vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury. She shoved the camera into Leo's hands. "Go, out the back, now," she hissed. "What about you?" Leo whispered, his heart seizing. "He knows my car is here. He'll know I came. This ends tonight. One way or another. I will not let him walk away from this. Now go." She pushed him towards the door of the study. He hesitated, torn. Leaving her felt like a betrayal. But he had the camera. He had the proof. That was the mission. He ran. He flew down the back staircase, his feet barely touching the steps. He burst out the side door and into the garden, his lungs on fire. He didn't look back. He scrambled into the van, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He peeled out of the service entrance and onto the street, the tires screaming. He drove for a few blocks, then killed the lights and pulled over, his body racked with tremors. He looked back at the house. Lights were on now, on the first and second floors. Silhouettes moved behind the curtains. He had the evidence. But he had left Eleanor in the lion's den. What followed was the longest hour of his life. He sat in the dark, the Sony camera on the seat beside him, a totem of unimaginable horror. He imagined 1,000 terrible scenarios. Finch returning. A struggle. Eleanor silenced forever. Then, the street was flooded with light. Police cars, sirens, screaming, descended on the judge's mansion. An ambulance followed. Leo's heart stopped. What had she done? He had to see. He had to know. He got out of the van and crept back towards the house, staying in the shadows of the massive oak trees. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Officers were swarming the property. Paramedics were rushing inside with a gurney. Leo watched, hidden his breath, held tight in his chest. A few minutes later, the paramedics emerged. The gurney was not for Eleanor. On it, strapped down, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, was Judge Alistair Finch. There was a dark, bloody wound on the side of his head, but he was alive, he was conscious. And as they loaded him into the ambulance, his eyes scanned the crowd, the street, the darkness. For a moment, Leo could have sworn their eyes met. A look of pure, undiluted hatred passed from the judge, a promise of retribution. Then, Eleanor walked out the front door. She was flanked by 2 detectives, but she was not in handcuffs. She was wrapped in a blanket, her expression serene, almost beatific. She had done it. She had faced the monster and she had won. Leo later learned the details from the news, which exploded with the story. The man who had entered the house was Finch's neighbor, concerned about the lights. He had found Finch on the floor of his study, bleeding from a head wound, and Eleanor standing over him, a heavy crystal decanter in her hand. The first thing she had said to the neighbor, and then to the police, was, "Check the safe." His name was David Miller. The discovery of the camera, the blackmail material, and the subsequent leak of Leo's drone footage, and the memory card he had anonymously sent to a trusted investigative journalist, brought the entire city to a standstill. The story of the Miller family's camping accident was ripped open, revealing the rot beneath. Finch's trial was the cinematic moment the city had been waiting for, a public exorcism of a secret evil. The courtroom was a circus. But through all the noise, 2 things stood out with devastating clarity. The first was the video. When they played David Miller's confession, a profound, gut-wrenching silence fell over the courtroom. The jury wept. The gallery gasped. The raw, unfiltered agony of a man forced to destroy his own family was more powerful than any legal argument. It was the voice of the dead, crying out for justice. The second was Eleanor. She took the stand, no longer a ghost, but a woman forged in fire. She looked directly at her ex-husband, her voice clear and unwavering, and she told the world everything. She described the psychological torture. She described the night he came home, high on the thrill of the kill. She described the years of silent complicity, the prison he had built for her. She didn't just testify against him, she dismantled him, piece by piece. Stripping away the veneer of civility to expose the monster beneath, Finch's defense crumbled. His power, his influence, meant nothing against the pure, undeniable truth of the video and the moral force of his wife's testimony. He was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. The moment of the verdict was the cinematic payoff Leo had been fighting for. As the foreman read the word guilty, a collective gasp, then a sob, then a roar of approval swept through the courtroom. Finch, the untouchable king, sat stone-faced for a moment, and then he seemed to collapse in on himself, the weight of his sins finally crushing him. He looked old, small, and pathetic. But the most cathartic moment came as they led him away in handcuffs. He passed by Eleanor. He stopped, his eyes filled with a venomous rage. He opened his mouth to say something, to spit one last piece of poison. But Eleanor spoke first. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the courtroom like a razor. "This is for them, Alistair," she said. "For David, and Sarah, and Chloe, and Finn. And this is for Julian. And this is for me." It was not a statement of revenge. It was a statement of liberation. A final, quiet reclaiming of her own name, her own soul. The judge flinched as if she had struck him. The bailiffs led him away, a fallen god being dragged to his underworld. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been seized, ripped from the hands of a monster in the most public and humiliating way possible. The ghosts of the Miller family, and the ghost of Eleanor Vance's old life, could finally rest. The media storm eventually subsided. The name Alistair Finch became a synonym for hypocrisy and evil, a permanent stain on the city's history. He would die in prison, years later, a forgotten man. For Leo, life returned to a semblance of normalcy, but he was a changed man. The world looked different to him now, the shadows deeper. the lines between good and evil both sharper and more terrifyingly blurred. He still flew his drone, but he no longer sought out the forgotten places. He had seen enough ghosts. Sometimes he would think of the Millers. He had never known them, but he felt an intimate connection to their tragedy. He had been their messenger, the instrument of their long-delayed justice. He hoped, wherever they were, they had found peace. One cool autumn afternoon, a year after the trial, he received a small, unmarked package in the mail. Inside was a simple card and a photograph. The card was from Eleanor Vance. It read, "Thank you, you gave me back my life." The photograph was old, faded. It was a picture of the Miller family, taken on a sunny day before the darkness had found them. David had his arms around Sarah, both of them laughing. Little Chloe, with her gap-toothed grin, was perched on her father's shoulders. And Shy Finn was holding his teddy bear, a small, content smile on his face. They looked happy. They looked alive. They looked free. Leo took the photograph and drove back up into the mountains. He didn't go to the high ridge where the tent had been. That place was a wound, a site of trauma. Instead, he found a quiet, peaceful meadow with a view of the snow-capped peaks. The air was clean and cold. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. He found a tall, ancient cedar tree at the edge of the meadow. At its base, he built a small cairn of stones. It wasn't a grave marker. It was a memorial. A place of remembrance, not of their death, but of their life. He carefully placed the photograph within the stones, protecting it from the elements. He stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He thought about the cost of truth, the weight of secrets, the fragility of a life. The drone had captured an image of a tomb, but it had ultimately led to an act of resurrection, not of the bodies, but of the truth. The world would move on. New scandals would break, new tragedies would capture the public's attention. But here, in this quiet meadow, the Miller family would be remembered, not as victims of a monster, but as a father, a mother, and two children who had loved each other, and who, in the end, had been loved back by a world that refused to let them be forgotten. The emotional echo of their story would linger, a haunting reminder that even in the deepest, darkest woods, a single persistent hum can be the sound of justice, searching for a place to land. And sometimes, the most profound healing is found not in forgetting, but in the simple, quiet act of bearing witness. The hum of the drone was gone, replaced by the silence of the mountains, a silence that finally felt like peace.